Dear listener, welcome to this calm and unhurried journey through history here on the Histovale channel. We sincerely hope you are finding full rest in this late hour of the night. Now, let us enter that quiet chapter of history.
In the sweltering, dust-choked summer of 1852, the Sierra Nevada mountains were a theater of frantic noise and desperate ambition. The California gold rush was at its zenith, a chaotic symphony of pickaxes striking quartz and the roar of hydraulic cannons tearing into the red earth. Yet, far above the crowded claims of the American River, tucked into a nameless ravine choked with manzanita and scrub oak, sat a silence that seemed to predate the continent itself. Here, in a shallow, hand-dug tunnel, known only as the Argonaut's Crevice, a discovery was made that had nothing to do with the glittering flakes of the stream bed and everything to do with the heavy, dark secrets of the deep earth. It was in this cooling, damp tunnel that a surveyor named Elias Thorne, a man of quiet disposition and a background in classical philology, unearthed a small iron-bound chest. Inside, protected by layers of oil-treated canvas, lay a single massive volume, the Argonaut's Ledger. The anatomy of the ledger. The ledger was not the typical mud-stained diary of a 49er. It was bound in thick, midnight blue leather that appeared black in the dim light of a lantern, an obsidian-like finish that felt cold to the touch. The pages were made of high-quality vellum, and the handwriting was not the hurried scrawl of a miner, but the elegant, rhythmic calligraphy of a professional clerk. The entries did not track ounces of dust or the price of flour. Instead, they recorded the extraction of something the author referred to only as the unrefined ore. To the casual observer of 1852, unrefined ore would suggest raw gold still trapped in quartz. However, Thorne's keen eye noticed a series of chemical notations in the margins that suggested something far denser. The ledger detailed weights and volumes that defied the physics of common gold. It spoke of a mineral that possessed a luminous density, a substance that was stored not in bags, but in lead-lined canisters to dampen its vibrational hum. This was the first hint of the Obsidian Vault. The ledger suggested that the gold rush was merely a surface phenomenon, a distraction for the masses, while a small clandestine group of Argonauts, intellectuals and financiers from the East, were mining a far older, far more potent legacy buried within the granite roots of the Sierra Nevada. The mystery of the missing tons. The most baffling section of the ledger was the inventory of the invisible. It listed 44 shipments of unrefined ore that had been moved from the Argonaut's Crevice toward a destination marked only as the 0 point. Thorne, using his skills as a surveyor, attempted to cross-reference these shipments with the official records of the San Francisco Mint and the Wells Fargo stagecoach lines. To his astonishment, he found a total vacuum. These tons of material, estimated at nearly $6 million in 19th century value, simply did not exist on any public manifest. They had been moved through the mountains with a surgical, bureaucratic silence. The ledger hinted at a specialized logistics network. The silent mules. Shipments moved only during the gray hours of dawn, using paths that avoided the main mining camps. The acoustic shield. The Argonauts utilized a series of remote mountain passes where the specific echoes of the terrain muffled the sound of the heavy wagons. The false cargo.
On the rare occasions the wagons were seen, they were labeled as geological samples for the Smithsonian, a cover that invited boredom rather than curiosity. The philosophy of the hidden. As Thorne read deeper into the ledger by the flickering light of his camp, he realized he was not looking at a record of greed, but a record of preservation. The author of the ledger, an anonymous figure who signed himself only as the clerk, wrote about the gold not as currency, but as a conductive medium. The Argonauts believed that the Sierra Nevada contained a subterranean chamber of natural obsidian, a subterranean library formed by volcanic activity millions of years ago. They were not just mining gold, they were using the gold to key a vault that held records of a pre-colonial history, a civilization that had mastered the language of the stones. The unrefined ore was the fuel for a monumental project of geological archiving. The gold was being returned to the earth, placed into a vault where it would act as a preservative for thousands of ancient manuscripts and maps that the Argonauts had gathered from across the globe, fearing the industrial age would destroy the world's spiritual and intellectual heritage. The first clue to the vault. The final entry of the first section of the ledger was a cryptic mathematical sequence. The weight of the ore is the weight of the silence. Look to the shadow that does not move when the sun rises. This was Thorne's first encounter with the lithospheric cipher. It suggested that the vault was not marked by a door or a sign, but a gravitational or optical anomaly in the landscape. The ledger ended its first chapter with a drawing of a giant sequoia, its roots wrapping around a stone door that appeared to be made of solid shadow. Elias Thorne closed the ledger, the heavy blue leather cool against his palms. Outside, the Sierra Nevada wind moaned through the pines, a long, low sound that seemed to carry the weight of the unrefined ore. He knew that he was no longer a surveyor of land, but a surveyor of ghosts. The gold rush was a clamor of the present, but the ledger was a whisper from a deep obsidian past, a journey that would lead him away from the light of the camps and into the permanent, echoing silence of the mountain's heart.
Elias Thorne's journey into the heart of the Sierra Nevada was no longer a pursuit of gold, but a descent into a complex, ancient mathematical puzzle. Having secured the Argonauts' ledger, Thorne realized that the 0 point mentioned in the text was not a coordinate on any human map. The map was the mountain itself. To find the entrance to the Obsidian Vault, one had to unlearn the language of paper and ink and learn the lithospheric cipher, the silent geometric language of the stones. In the mid-19th century, geology was a burgeoning science, yet the Argonauts had seemingly mastered a branch of it that bordered on the metaphysical. They viewed the Earth's crust not as a chaotic mess of rock, but as a structured, crystalline storage device. The cipher was built upon the concept that the mountain's very layers, its strata, were the lines of a code, and the faults were its punctuation, the geometry of the granite. Thorne spent weeks in the high altitudes, away from the clatter of the mining camps, observing the great Sierra batholith. The ledger had provided him with a starting point. The stone does not lie, but it only speaks to those who measure the pressure of the deep. He began to notice strange, deliberate anomalies in the granite walls of the high canyons. In a region known as the Shadow Basin, Thorne found a series of etchings that most would have dismissed as natural erosion or glacial scarring. However,
When viewed through a surveyor's transit, these scars aligned into perfect, repeating fractals. This was the lithospheric cipher. The Argonauts had used a technique of stress mapping. By applying immense pressure to specific points in the rock, they had forced the granite to fracture in predictable geometric patterns. These patterns acted as a directional guide. If you followed the angle of the secondary cleavage planes, the way the rock naturally splits, they would lead you not to a vein of gold, but to the next marker in the sequence. The language of the strata. The second layer of the cipher involved the stratigraphic sequence. Thorne discovered that the ledger's numerical codes corresponded to the thickness of specific mineral veins: quartz, feldspar, and mica. The quartz key, a vein of white quartz exactly 4 inches thick, pointed toward the setting sun. The mica gradient, a layer of shimmering mica, indicated the depth variable, how far beneath the surface the next chamber lay. It was a form of acoustic geology. Thorne realized that if he struck the rock with a rhythmic pattern, the echo returned with a specific pitch that changed depending on the density of the stone behind it. The Argonauts had hollowed out sections of the mountain to create resonant chambers. These chambers acted like a subterranean pipe organ. When the wind blew through certain high-altitude fissures, the entire mountain would emit a low-frequency hum, a sound so deep it was felt in the marrow of the bones rather than heard by the ears. The cipher of the frozen shadow. The most elusive part of the lithospheric cipher was what the ledger called the frozen shadow. Thorne found a massive slab of obsidian, dark volcanic glass, embedded deep within a granite cliff. This was an impossibility in the local geology, suggesting it had been transported there or forged through unknown means. The obsidian was polished to a mirror finish. The cipher instructed Thorne to wait for the equinox. At the precise moment the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the minarets, the light hit a natural crystalline spire across the valley. This spire acted as a prism, throwing a beam of light onto the obsidian slab. For exactly 60 seconds, the light revealed a hidden inscription etched inside the glass, a series of non-human symbols that looked like the crystalline structure of a diamond. This was the language of the stones. It wasn't a set of instructions, it was a vibrational frequency. The symbols told Thorne exactly where the stone pulse was strongest. The realization of the vault. As Thorne decoded the final sequence of the lithospheric cipher, he understood the true scale of the Argonauts' ambition. They hadn't just built a box in the mountain, they had turned the mountain into a static engine. The 0 point was the center of a geological nexus where the tectonic pressure was perfectly balanced, creating a pocket of absolute stability amidst the shifting earth. The cipher revealed that the entrance to the vault was not a door with a keyhole, but a lithic lock. To open it, one had to apply a specific frequency of sound, the song of the Sierra, to a particular granite face. The vibrations would cause the interlocking stone teeth of the mountain to retract, revealing the path to the obsidian vault. Elias Thorne stood alone on a precipice, the cold wind of the high Sierras whipping at his coat. He looked down at the ledger, then at the vast, silent peaks around him. The mountain was no longer a barrier. Having mastered the lithospheric cipher, Elias Thorne moved from the cold, fractured logic of the high granite peaks down into the emerald twilight of the great sequoia groves. The cipher had provided the vibrational frequency, but the mountain was vast, and the specific 0 point, the physical entrance to the Obsidian Vault, required a biological marker. As the Argonaut's ledger enigmatically stated, the stone provides the key, but the living wood provides the hand that turns it. In the mid-1850s, the giant sequoias were just being discovered by the outside world, though they had stood as silent sentinels for millennia. To the Argonauts, these trees were more than botanical wonders. They were chronometric pillars, living, breathing towers that acted as the final, slow-moving hands of a geological clock. The Living Survey, the Geometry of Giants. Thorn entered the grove known as the Silent Cathedral, a place where the trees grew so tall and dense that the forest floor existed in a state of permanent, cool dusk. The air was thick with the scent of tannin and ancient dust. Here, the geometry of the vault transitioned from the inanimate to the organic. The ledger detailed a process Thorn called the shadow map. He realized that the Argonauts had not chosen their location at random. They had identified a specific cluster of 5 sequoias, arranged in a perfect, naturally occurring pentagon. These were not just any trees, they were the grandfather pillars, trees whose root systems reached so deep into the Sierra granite that they were physically anchored to the very vault they guarded. The hand of the wood was the shadow of the sequoia. Because these trees were so immense, reaching nearly 300 feet into the sky, their shadows were not mere dark patches on the ground. They were massive, moving needles of darkness that swept across the forest floor with the precision of a celestial instrument. The alignment of the solstice. Thorn's task was to find the ghost shadow. According to the ledger, the entrance to the vault would only be revealed during the summer solstice at the exact moment when the sun reached its zenith. He spent days measuring the girth and angle of the grandfather pillars. He used his surveyor's transit to map the movement of their shadows, but he found that the shadows of the 5 trees never quite converged. There was a gap, a missing piece of the geometric puzzle. He returned to the ledger and found a footnote in the margins. The shadow of the living is not enough. One must look for the shadow of the dead. Searching the grove, Thorn found a massive fallen sequoia trunk, half buried in centuries of forest needles and moss. It was a ghost tree, a titan that had fallen long before the Argonauts arrived. Thorn realized that the Argonauts had used the stump of this fallen giant as the central datum point. By calculating where the shadow of the tallest standing sequoia would have intersected with the shadow of the fallen giant at noon on the solstice, Thorn found the null point. The shadow as a lever. On the day of the solstice, Thorn stood at the null point. As the sun climbed to its highest point, the massive 300-foot shadow of the tallest sequoia, a tree the ledger called the gnomon, began to stretch toward the moss-covered base of a sheer granite cliff hidden behind a screen of ferns. The shadow moved with an agonizing, majestic slowness. Thorn watched as the tip of the shadow, a dark, pointed finger, touched a specific, unadorned section of the rock. This was the mapping of the ancient grove. The shadow was not just a marker, it was a psychological lever. The Argonauts knew that no one would think to look for a door in a place that was only marked for 10 minutes once a year. The shadow provided the temporal lock, the resonance of the root. As the shadow touched the rock, Thorn applied the song of the Sierra he had decoded from the lithospheric cipher. He struck the granite face with a rhythmic cadence using a heavy stone hammer. The forest, usually silent, seemed to hold its breath. Then a low-frequency vibration began to hum, not from the rock, but from the roots of the sequoias themselves. The trees acted as organic resonators, carrying the vibration deep into the earth. The Argonauts had engineered a system where the root systems of the Grandfathers acted as a series of hydraulic levers. The ground beneath Thorn's feet trembled. The moss-covered granite face didn't swing open like a door. It subsided, sinking into the earth like the sound of a distant underground waterfall. Elias Thorn stood before the dark, vertical opening of the anatomy of the shaft. The shadow of the sequoia had pointed the way, and the song of the stone had opened the path. He looked back at the ancient grove one last time. The giants stood silent, their shadows already moving past the mark, sealing the secret for another year. Thorn stepped into the darkness, leaving the world of light and wood for the cold obsidian heart of the mountain.
As the granite slab subsided into the earth, Elias Thorn was met with a rush of air that smelled not of decay, but of ozone and ancient parchment. The shaft that lay before him was a marvel of mid-19th century engineering, a vertical descent that plunged nearly 500 feet into the dark, crystalline roots of the Sierra Nevada. This was the anatomy of the shaft, the carotid artery of the Obsidian Vault. Unlike the crude timber-propped shafts of the local gold mines, this descent was lined with smooth, interlocking blocks of dark basalt. Thorn descended via a counterweighted mechanical lift, a silent iron platform operated by a complex system of pulleys that utilized the weight of diverted groundwater from the forest above. As the light of the sequoia grove vanished into a tiny, distant square of blue, Thorn entered the subterranean library. The architecture of preservation. At the base of the shaft, the darkness was absolute until Thorn ignited his lantern. The beam cut through the gloom to reveal a chamber that defied the ruggedness of the frontier. The subterranean library was a vast circular hall carved directly from a pocket of natural obsidian. The walls were a deep, reflective black, polished to such a high sheen that Thorn's single lantern created 1,000 flickering ghosts in the glass. The Argonauts had designed the library using the cylindrical principle of stability. The room was a perfect dome, a geometry that allowed the mountain's immense weight to be distributed evenly across the obsidian walls. But it was the contents, not the architecture, that took Thorn's breath away. The walls were lined with thousands of deep recesses, each containing a lead-lined stone canister. These were the books of the Obsidian Vault, the archives of the lost world. Thorn approached one of the central alcoves. He carefully opened a canister to find a scroll of vellum preserved in a vacuum-sealed environment that utilized the mountain's natural anaerobic pressure. These were not merely records of gold shipments. The subterranean library was a repository for the intellectual heritage of a vanishing world. Thorn found pre-colonial cartography, maps of the Americas that predated European arrival, showing trade routes and civilizations that had been erased from the official history books. The celestial almanacs,
ancient astronomical charts that tracked the movements of stars over 10,000 years, revealing a profound understanding of the great year or the precession of the equinoxes. The philological tablets, glass-etched tablets containing the root languages of the indigenous peoples of the West, preserved so that their stories would not be silenced by the march of industrialization. The unrefined ore mentioned in the ledger was the gold used as a medium for the ink. The Argonauts had discovered that gold, when suspended in a specific mineral oil, was the only substance that would never fade or oxidize, ensuring that the records would remain legible for 10 millennia. The physics of silence. The anatomy of the library included a unique sensory feature, the absolute acoustic dampener. The obsidian walls, combined with the specific curvature of the dome, created a space where sound did not travel. Thorne noticed that even the sound of his own breathing seemed muffled, as if the mountain itself was pressing its thumb against the air. This was intentional. The Argonauts believed that high-frequency vibrations from the surface world, the thunder of cannons, the roar of steam engines, could disrupt the delicate molecular structure of the ancient vellum. The library was a vibrational sanctuary, a place where history could rest in total, undisturbed silence. As Thorne walked the perimeter of the dome, his lantern light caught the reflection of a massive obsidian table in the center of the hall. Upon it lay the final, most critical document, the Master Index. It was etched in the same language of the stones he had seen on the cliffside, a cipher that linked every canister in the vault to a specific nakshatra, or star in the sky. The Guardian of the Deep. The library was not merely a passive storage room, it was an active geological clock. Thorne observed a slow-moving crystalline pendulum hanging from the center of the dome. It swung with an impossibly slow rhythm, powered by the subtle hydrostatic pressure of the mountain's internal tides. This pendulum was the heart of the anatomy of the shaft. It regulated the temperature and humidity of the library, ensuring that the lost archives remained in a state of perfect frozen animation. Thorne realized that he was standing in the most secure location on the planet, a vault guarded by 500 feet of granite, the shadows of giants, and the cold, unyielding logic of obsidian. The gold rush continued on the surface, a feverish dream of wealth and noise. But down here, Elias Thorne had found the true unrefined ore, the collective memory of humanity, stored in the silent heart of the Sierra Nevada. He had found the library, but as the low hum of the mountain began to change pitch, he realized that the hydrostatic lock was beginning its cycle, and the door to the surface was preparing to seal once more.
As Elias Thorne stood in the center of the Obsidian Library, the initial wonder of the scrolls was suddenly eclipsed by a sound, a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to vibrate the very floor beneath his boots. This was not the mechanical grinding of gears, but the immense liquid power of the mountain's internal circulatory system. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he had triggered a seasonal transition. He was witnessing the activation of the hydrostatic lock, the living guardian of the deep. The Argonauts had not merely built a vault, they had harnessed the physics of water and the crushing weight of the Sierra Nevada to create a security system that was as invisible as it was invincible. The physics of the water column. The entry shaft Thorne had descended was more than a passage. It was a calibrated pressure valve. Above the obsidian vault,
Hidden within the higher folds of the mountain lay a series of natural, glacier-fed alpine basins. The Argonauts had engineered a series of subterranean conduits that linked these basins to the main shaft. The hydrostatic lock worked on the principle of the water column. When the internal pressure of the mountain reached a certain threshold, calculated by the melting of the winter snows, the conduits would open. Thousands of tons of water would flood the entry shaft, creating a vertical column of liquid 500 feet high. To an intruder on the surface, the entrance would appear to be nothing more than a flooded, stagnant well. But beneath that water was a pressure of nearly 220 pounds per square inch. No human diver of the 19th century and few modern machines could withstand the crushing weight required to reach the bottom. The water was the key, the door, and the sentry. The seasonal sentinel. The guardian of the deep was a master of temporal security. Thorne realized that the vault was only accessible during the dry window, a brief period in late autumn when the alpine basins were low and the mountain's internal aquifers had drained. The winter seal. In winter, the water in the conduits would freeze, creating a plug of solid ice that acted as a secondary impenetrable barrier. The spring flood. During the thaw, the hydrostatic pressure reached its peak, sealing the vault with a force that could crush iron. The autumn passage. Only when the first frosts of autumn began to lock the surface moisture did the water column recede, allowing the counterweighted lift to descend once more. Thorne watched as a thin film of water began to weep from the obsidian walls. The mountain was sensing the change in temperature from his lantern and the open shaft. The song of the stones he had played to enter was now being answered by the roar of the deep. The hydraulic balance. The most ingenious part of the lock was its balance mechanism. The Argonauts had designed the library floor to act as a massive floating piston. As the hydrostatic pressure increased in the shaft, it pushed against a series of copper bellows hidden beneath the obsidian floor. This pressure compressed the air within the library, creating a self-sustaining environment that prevented any outside moisture or bacteria from entering the archive chambers. The hydrostatic lock didn't just keep people out, it kept the environment out. It used the weight of the water to create a perfect, pressurized sanctuary for the vellum. The final warning. Thorne felt the air pressure in the room begin to rise, a popping sensation in his ears. The water at the base of the shaft was already rising, swirling around the iron platform of the lift. The guardian was waking up. He knew that if he did not ascend now, he would be trapped in this lightless obsidian cathedral for the next 6 months, assuming the air regulators held. He grabbed his bag and lunged for the lift. As the iron platform began its slow, counterweighted ascent, Thorne looked down one last time. The light of his lantern reflected off the rising water, which looked like a sheet of dark, polished glass rising to meet him. The hydrostatic rock was closing the chapter. The 0 point was returning to its state of liquid isolation. The archives were safe, guarded by the weight of the Sierras and the relentless, silent power of the deep water. Thorne reached the surface just as the granite slab slid back into place, sealed not by a lock, but by the overwhelming, quiet pressure of the mountain itself.
The escape of Elias Thorne from the depths of the Sierra Nevada marked the final human interaction with the Obsidian Vault. As he stood in the cool night air of the ancient grove, the silence that followed the closing of the granite door was absolute. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the beginning of the geological silence, a state of permanent, undisturbed isolation that has lasted for over a century and a half. The vault, with its unrefined ore and lost archives, transitioned from a secret project into an unclaimed legacy, protected by the very earth it sought to document. In the modern age, the mystery of the Obsidian Vault remains one of the most profound null zones in American history. It is a story of how nature, time, and corporate pragmatism combined to ensure that some secrets are never meant to be unearthed. The erasure of the trail. Elias Thorne did not attempt to return. The Argonaut's ledger remained in his possession, but he realized that the dry window of the hydrostatic lock was shifting. The climate of the West was changing. The predictable cycles of the 1850s were being altered by the early signs of industrial warming and shifting tectonic plates. The song of the stones he had used was a frequency tuned to a specific moment in geological time. Thorne spent his final years in a quiet library in San Francisco, never speaking of the Obsidian halls. When he passed away, his journals were sold at an estate auction, eventually ending up in the private collection of a railroad tycoon, who, recognizing the threat the lost archives posed to official land claims, ordered them to be archived, which, in the language of the elite, meant buried in a different kind of vault. The modern technological failure. You might wonder why, in the era of satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, GPR, the Obsidian Vault has not been found. The answer lies in the anatomy of the mountain. The Sierra Nevada is not a uniform block of stone. It is a chaotic mix of highly conductive magnetite, dense granite, and the natural obsidian pocket that houses the library. Modern geophysical surveys depend on the reflection of waves. However, the obsidian walls of the vault are acoustically transparent to many modern frequencies. To a radar sweep, the vault looks like nothing more than a solid, natural density shift in the rock. Furthermore, the hydrostatic lock remains active. The subterranean water column creates a massive heat sink and a pressure shield that distorts thermal imaging. To a satellite, the area appears as a cold spot, indistinguishable from the thousands of other deep-shadowed ravines in the high Sierras. The mountain is actively camouflaging its contents with the same physics the Argonauts harnessed in 1852. The legal and financial void. Perhaps the greatest protector of the Obsidian Vault is not the stone, but the financial null. Much like the Night Owl Express, the assets within the vault, the gold medium and the land grant archives, exist in a legal vacuum. If the vault were opened today, it would reveal maps and titles that would invalidate billions of dollars in modern real estate, mining rights, and government boundaries. The unclaimed legacy is a ticking bomb for the American legal system. Consequently, there is a silent consensus among the powers that be. The vault must remain a myth. Insurance companies, historical societies, and federal agencies have all, at various times, come across whispers of the Argonauts. Yet every official inquiry ends in a geological silence. No permits for deep earth excavation are granted in that sector of the Sierra Nevada, citing environmental fragility or indigenous heritage protection. The law has become the final layer of the vault's lid. The enduring calm of the grove. Today, the silent cathedral grove still stands.
The grandfather pillars are now centuries older, their bark thicker, their roots even more deeply entwined with the obsidian roof far below. The shadow of the sequoia still sweeps across the forest floor every summer solstice, pointing its dark, silent finger at a granite face that looks like any other. The Obsidian Vault is the ultimate boring history. It is a treasure that cannot be spent, a library that cannot be read, and a mystery that refuses to be solved. It rests in a state of perfect pressurized animation, a silent witness to the frantic noise of the world above. The unrefined ore of the Argonauts remains unrefined, and the language of the stones remains unspoken. In the end, the mountain won. It took the ambition of men and turned it into a part of the Straya. The legacy of the West is not what we built on top of the land, but what we were forced to leave behind, deep within the geological silence of the Sierra Nevada. This long and detailed discussion of American history slowly comes to an end right here. We hope that this quiet narration has helped your mind find rest and has made your sleep even deeper and more comfortable. To listen to another dull yet important chapter from the pages of history on a future night, you may follow the channel. May every one of your nights be tranquil and restful. Good night.